Three women walked into Halloween night and vanished without a trace. October 31st, 1991. October 31st, 1995. October 31st, 1998. For 20 years, three families waited. Three communities mourned. Three cases went cold. But in November 2018, when workers began demolishing an old community center in Cedar Falls, Iowa, they discovered something hidden in the basement. Something that would finally answer the question everyone had been asking for 2 decades. Where did they go? Cedar Falls, Iowa, seemed like the kind of place where nothing truly terrible could happen. Population 40,000, nestled in the heart of the Midwest, where neighbors knew each other's names, and Halloween was still the kind of holiday where parents let their children roam freely from house to house collecting candy. The community center stood at the heart of downtown, a sturdy brick building constructed in 1975, hosting youth programs, senior activities, and volunteer coordination for local charities. Everyone in Cedar Falls had passed through its doors at some point. Everyone trusted the people who worked there, and that trust would prove fatal for three women who thought they were safe in their own hometown. Megan Phillips was 28 years old on October 31st, 1991, and she had every reason to believe this Halloween would be magical. Her 6-year-old daughter Emma had been planning her princess costume for weeks, practicing her trick-or-treat greeting in front of the bathroom mirror each morning before school. Megan worked as an emergency room nurse at Cedar Falls Medical Center, pulling long shifts that often stretched past midnight, but she'd specifically requested Halloween night off so she could watch Emma's face light up with each candy bar dropped into her plastic pumpkin bucket. The plan was simple and safe. Megan's mother would take Emma trick-or-treating through the safe neighborhoods on the east side of town, hitting all the houses that gave out full-size candy bars, while Megan finished up some paperwork at the hospital. They'd meet back at Megan's small rental house on Maple Street by 9 o'clock, where Megan would have hot chocolate waiting, and they'd sort through Emma's candy haul together, picking out all the Reese's cups because those were Emma's favorites. But Megan never made it home that night. Her mother waited with Emma on the front porch, watching her granddaughter's excitement slowly transform into confusion and then worry as the minutes ticked past 9, then 9:30, then 10. Emma kept asking where Mommy was, and Megan's mother kept saying she'd be there any minute, even as a cold knot of fear began forming in her stomach. By 10:15, she called Megan's work, only to learn that Megan had left the hospital at 9:20. The drive home should have taken no more than 12 minutes. At 10:45, with Emma finally asleep on the couch still wearing her princess costume, Megan's mother called the Cedar Falls Police Department to report her daughter missing. The initial response was frustratingly casual. The dispatcher assured her that adults often lost track of time, that Megan had probably stopped at a friend's house or run into someone she knew. "Give it until morning," the dispatcher said. "She'll turn up." But morning came with no sign of Megan. Her car was found in the hospital parking lot exactly where she'd left it, her work badge still clipped to the visor. Her purse was discovered in the bushes near Riverside Park, which sat directly between the hospital and her home, about 5 blocks from each location. Inside the purse, investigators found her wallet with $43 in cash, her credit cards, and a photo of Emma that she carried everywhere. The only thing missing was her keys. 2 teenagers came forward that afternoon, hesitantly admitting they'd been smoking cigarettes behind the community center around 9:45 the previous night and had seen a woman matching Megan's description talking to a man in the parking lot. They couldn't make out his face in the darkness and couldn't hear what they were discussing, but they remembered she seemed relaxed, not frightened. "Like she knew him," one of the teenagers said, "like they were just having a normal conversation." The man had been wearing a dark jacket, they thought, maybe jeans, but the details were frustratingly vague. They'd been more focused on not getting caught smoking than on memorizing the appearance of random people in a parking lot. Detective James Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department, led the investigation into Megan's disappearance with a thoroughness that came from both professional dedication and personal connection. His own daughter was only 3 years older than Emma, and the thought of what that little girl was going through, waiting for a mother who would never come home, haunted him during every waking hour of the investigation. He interviewed Megan's ex-boyfriend, the father of her child, who had an airtight alibi, working a night shift at the John Deere factory with 50 witnesses who could confirm his presence. He spoke with every single person Megan worked with at the hospital, every neighbor on her street, every parent whose child attended programs at the community center where Megan had volunteered. He found absolutely nothing. No enemies, no stalkers, no suspicious behavior in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Megan Phillips had simply vanished. The case consumed Detective Walsh for 6 months before the harsh reality of police work forced him to accept that without new leads, without a body, without any physical evidence beyond an abandoned purse, there was nowhere else to look. The file marked Phillips, Megan, missing person was moved to the cold case storage room in the basement of the police station, and Emma went to live with her grandmother full-time. The little girl who'd been so excited about Halloween in 1991 grew to hate the holiday, associating orange pumpkins and candy corn with the night her mother disappeared forever. 4 years later, on October 31st, 1995, Victoria Hayes left Riverside Elementary School at 8:15 in the evening, tired but satisfied after a successful Halloween carnival. At 31 years old, Victoria taught 3rd grade and had spent the past month transforming her classroom into a haunted forest for the school's annual Halloween celebration. She'd stayed 2 hours after the carnival ended, helping clean up spilled punch and wayward candy wrappers, making sure everything was perfect for Monday morning when her students returned. Her fiancé David was waiting at Giuseppe's Italian restaurant downtown, their favorite spot, where they had reservations at 8:30. Victoria was running late, as she often did, but David knew her well enough to order her usual glass of Chianti and wait patiently. She'd texted him at 8:05 saying she was leaving in 10 minutes. That text message would be the last communication anyone ever received from Victoria Hayes. When she didn't arrive by 9, David called her cell phone. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. At 9:20, he drove to the school and found her car still sitting alone in the dark parking lot, a carved pumpkin she'd bought for her classroom visible through the back window. The school doors were locked, the lights off. No sign of Victoria anywhere. David's concern transformed into panic. He called 911, and within 20 minutes, patrol officers were searching the building and surrounding area. They found Victoria's costume wings, delicate fabric butterfly wings she'd worn to entertain the children, discarded in the dumpster behind the school. They found nothing else. The janitor, a 70-year-old man named Harold who'd worked at Riverside Elementary for 30 years, told police he'd seen Victoria getting into a car around 8:20, just as he was finishing up his own work for the evening. He'd been in the utility room, about to lock up, when he glanced out the window and saw her walking across the parking lot toward a vehicle that had just pulled in. She seemed to know whoever it was, Harold said. She walked right up to the car and got in the passenger side, like it was someone giving her a ride or someone she was expecting to meet. Harold's description of the vehicle was maddeningly imprecise. Maybe a sedan, maybe dark blue or black. He wasn't certain. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time because Victoria had been smiling. The detectives pressed him for more details. Had he seen the driver? Just a shape, Harold said. A person in the driver's seat. But I couldn't tell you if it was a man or woman, young or old. The interior light didn't come on when she got in. That detail would haunt investigators later because it suggested deliberation. Most cars' interior lights activate automatically when a door opens. Someone had either disabled that feature or manually turned it off, creating a darkness that would conceal identity. Detective Walsh, still carrying the weight of Megan Phillips' unsolved disappearance, immediately saw the pattern that should have been obvious, but somehow wasn't. 2 women, both connected to the community, both vanishing on Halloween night. The problem was that the Phillips case had been handled by city police, while Victoria Hayes disappeared in county jurisdiction, just outside the city limits where the school sat. The 2 departments had separate record systems, separate case files, separate everything. If Walsh hadn't been personally familiar with both investigations, the connection might have gone unnoticed entirely. He brought his concerns to his captain, arguing they needed to look for a serial predator who targeted women on Halloween. His captain, a practical man more concerned with budgets than theories, asked a simple question that Walsh couldn't answer. Where's the evidence? The investigation into Victoria's disappearance consumed the community. She'd been beloved. the kind of teacher who remembered every student's birthday and stayed after school to help struggling readers. Parents organized search parties that combed through the woods surrounding Cedar Falls, checked abandoned buildings, knocked on doors throughout the county, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual on Halloween night. The local news ran stories every evening for 3 weeks, showing Victoria's photograph, pleading for information. David offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to her whereabouts. Nothing materialized. Victoria Hayes joined Megan Phillips in that terrible limbo reserved for the missing, neither confirmed dead nor proven alive. Frozen forever in that last moment when someone saw them getting into a car or walking through a parking lot, suspended in uncertainty that was somehow worse than grief because it never allowed for closure. By the spring of 1996, Victoria's case had also gone cold. David kept her engagement ring in his pocket, unable to accept that she was gone, unable to move forward with his life. Detective Walsh developed an ulcer from the stress of 2 unsolved disappearances, and the families of both women formed a support group, meeting monthly at the public library, sharing their pain and their determination to keep their loved ones' memories alive. Then came October 31st, 1998. Brooke Carter was 26 years old, in her second year of pharmacy school at the University of Iowa, home for the weekend to visit her parents. She'd always loved Halloween, even as an adult, and had made plans with friends to attend a costume party at The Mill, a popular bar in downtown Cedar Falls. At 10:30 that evening, she kissed her mother goodbye, told her father not to wait up, and walked out the front door of her childhood home on Elm Street. Her friends were already at the bar, texts on her phone showing they'd sent her 3 messages asking when she'd arrive. "On my way," Brooke had replied at 10:28, "Be there in 10 minutes." She never arrived. Her phone was found the next morning on the sidewalk 3 blocks from her parents' house, screen cracked as if it had been dropped or thrown. Her student ID was discovered in someone's front yard another 2 blocks away. Her jacket, a vintage denim piece she'd bought at a thrift store and loved dearly, was found hanging from a fence near the community center. It was as if someone had been systematically removing items from Brooke's possession and scattering them along a trail, breadcrumbs leading nowhere. But this time, there was a witness with crucial information. Mrs. Helen Whitmore, an elderly woman who lived on Elm Street and habitually suffered from insomnia, had been standing at her kitchen window at 10:32 when she saw Brooke walking down the sidewalk. She was on her phone, Mrs. Whitmore told police, smiling like she was texting someone. Then this van pulled up beside her. White van, I think, or maybe light-colored. Had some words on the side, but I couldn't read them from my window. The van stopped and Brooke walked over to it. The driver must have said something to her because she nodded and looked at her phone again. Then she got in. Just got right in the passenger seat like she knew whoever was driving. This disappearance couldn't be ignored or isolated. 3 women all vanishing on October 31st, all last seen getting into vehicles with people they apparently recognized or trusted. The FBI was called in, and Special Agent Rebecca Morrison arrived in Cedar Falls with a team of profilers and analysts who set up a command center in the community center's largest conference room, a location choice that carried an irony no one could have predicted at the time. Agent Morrison was thorough and relentless. She interviewed hundreds of people, created detailed timelines of each victim's last known movements, analyzed every scrap of evidence from all 3 cases. She identified the patterns that connected the disappearances beyond just the date. All 3 women had been involved in community activities. Megan volunteered at youth programs. Victoria worked with school events. Brooke had helped with church fundraisers during her summers home from college. All 3 had interacted with the community center at various points, attending events, dropping off donations, participating in volunteer coordination meetings. The community center became the geographic and social hub connecting 3 women who had never met each other, whose paths had never crossed except through this single institution. Agent Morrison developed a profile of their likely perpetrator. Male, probably between 25 and 45 years old during the first disappearance in 1991. Someone deeply embedded in the community, trusted, possibly in a position of authority or social standing that allowed him to approach women without raising suspicion. Someone with access to vehicles, possibly through work. Someone obsessed with Halloween, using the holiday's chaos and distraction as cover for his crimes. Someone patient and methodical, capable of going 4 years between attacks, controlled enough to avoid detection for 7 years and counting. She presented her findings to local law enforcement, to the media, to anyone who would listen. She generated tips and leads that the task force investigated exhaustively. Nothing panned out. What Agent Morrison couldn't know, what no one could know, was that the person they were looking for had been in that very building throughout the investigation, had walked past the FBI command center multiple times, had even brought coffee and donuts one morning as a friendly gesture that everyone appreciated. Brandon Lee was 32 years old in 1998, a familiar face around Cedar Falls, known for his volunteer work and his friendly demeanor. He'd been the youth coordinator at the community center in 1991, coordinating programs that Megan Phillips' daughter Emma attended. He'd worked with schools on volunteer initiatives in 1995, collaborating with teachers like Victoria Hayes on community service projects. He'd helped coordinate church events in 1998, including the very fundraiser where Brooke Carter had volunteered that previous summer. He was everyone's friend, the guy who remembered names, who asked about your family, who seemed genuinely invested in making Cedar Falls a better place. And he had been killing women on Halloween for 7 years without anyone suspecting a thing. The investigation eventually wound down. The FBI task force packed up their command center and returned to their regional office, promising to keep the cases active, but acknowledging they'd hit every wall that existed. Detective Walsh retired in 2003, the unsolved cases haunting him into his retirement years. New detectives inherited the files, glanced through them periodically, added the occasional note when a potential lead emerged, but nothing ever came of it. The Halloween vanishings became local legend, the kind of story parents told to convince their teenagers to be careful on Halloween night, to not walk alone, to not trust strangers, to always let someone know where you were going. Emma Phillips grew up without her mother. She went into foster care when her grandmother died of cancer in 1997, bounced between 3 different homes before aging out of the system at 18. She became a social worker, dedicating her life to helping other children who'd experienced trauma and loss, channeling her own pain into something purposeful. But she never stopped wondering what happened to her mother, never stopped hoping that someday someone would find answers. David Hayes never married. He kept Victoria's engagement ring in a small wooden box on his bedside table, looking at it every morning and every night, maintaining a hope that he knew was irrational but couldn't abandon. He attended every annual memorial service held for the 3 women, standing with the families who'd formed their own community through shared grief. Robert and Susan Carter, Brooke's parents, founded an organization called the October Coalition, advocating for better resources for cold case investigations, for improved communication between law enforcement agencies, for families of missing persons who felt forgotten by a system that had moved on while their worlds remained frozen in the moment their loved ones vanished. Their activism kept all 3 cases in the public consciousness, ensuring that new detectives assigned to cold cases would review the files, that the Halloween vanishings wouldn't be completely forgotten. And then came November 2018, 20 years after the last disappearance. The Cedar Falls Community Center had closed in 2010, a victim of budget cuts and declining attendance as the community shifted its activities to a newer recreation facility on the other side of town. The building sat empty for 8 years, slowly deteriorating until the city council finally voted to have it demolished and the land sold for redevelopment. A construction company called Midwest Demolition won the bid to tear down the structure. And on November 7, 2018, their crew arrived with excavators and wrecking balls to begin the process of erasing a building that had been a community fixture for 43 years. The crew foreman, a man named Marcus Webb, always reviewed building blueprints before beginning demolition, checking for asbestos, lead paint, structural concerns that might affect the timeline or safety of the work. As he studied the 1975 blueprints for the community center, something caught his attention. The basement level showed a utility room, a boiler room, storage areas, and a large open space used for additional programming when the upstairs rooms were full. But when Marcus walked through the actual basement, measuring spaces and comparing them to the drawings, he noticed a discrepancy. According to the blueprints, the northwest corner of the basement should have extended another 12 feet. But when he measured, he found a wall where empty space should have been. a wall that didn't appear on the original building plans. Marcus brought this to the attention of the site supervisor, who initially dismissed it as a renovation or modification done after the original construction, probably not documented because it was internal and didn't affect the building's exterior or structural integrity. But Marcus was bothered by something else he'd noticed. The wall in question was different from the others. While the basement walls were primarily concrete block, standard for 1975 construction, this particular wall was framed with wood studs and covered with drywall that had been painted the same industrial beige as everything else but was clearly newer, maybe added in the 1980s or 1990s based on the materials and construction technique. What if there's something behind there we need to know about before we start knocking walls down? Marcus asked his supervisor. Could be old wiring, could be plumbing, could be hazardous materials someone walled off instead of properly removing. The supervisor, more concerned with avoiding delays than satisfying Marcus's curiosity, finally agreed to let him knock a small inspection hole in the drywall just to see what was behind it before they brought in the heavy equipment. Marcus used a sledgehammer to punch through the drywall, expecting to find empty space or maybe some old storage shelves someone had decided to wall off rather than remove. Instead, his flashlight beam revealed a room, an actual hidden room, roughly 8 feet by 12 feet, with a concrete floor and walls that had been painted black. And the room was not empty. What Marcus Webb discovered in that hidden room would finally answer questions that had haunted Cedar Falls for 20 years. But it would also raise new horrors that no one had imagined. He immediately stopped work and called the police, his hands shaking as he tried to explain what he'd found. "You need to send detectives," he said to the dispatcher. "You need to send everyone. I think I just found where those Halloween women went." Detective Sarah Mitchell was 38 years old in November 2018, a specialist in cold cases with the Iowa Bureau of Investigation. And she'd been obsessed with the Halloween vanishings since she was assigned to review the files in 2015. She'd been 11 years old in 1991, living in Cedar Falls when Megan Phillips disappeared. Her older sister Jennifer had been friends with Megan, and Sarah remembered the devastating impact Megan's disappearance had on Jennifer, who'd struggled with anxiety and trust issues for years afterward. When Sarah became a detective, when she was finally given access to cold case files, the Halloween vanishings became her white whale, the case she reviewed endlessly, looking for the detail everyone else had missed. She'd noticed something 3 years earlier that had bothered her ever since. All 3 women had connections to the community center, and all 3 had known or interacted with a man named Brandon Lee. Megan had worked with him on youth programming. Victoria had attended volunteer coordination meetings that Brandon ran. Brooke had participated in a church fundraiser that Brandon helped organize. But knowing someone and proving they'd committed 3 murders were entirely different things. Sarah had interviewed Brandon Lee in 2016, a casual conversation disguised as routine follow-up on old cases. He'd been cooperative, friendly, apparently sincere in his desire to help. He'd expressed appropriate sadness about the disappearances, mentioned how they had affected the whole community, talked about the importance of safety awareness. Sarah's instincts had screamed that something was wrong, that his responses were too practiced, too perfect, but instincts weren't evidence. She'd had nothing to justify further investigation, and Brandon Lee had remained free, living his quiet life, volunteering at a Lutheran church, seemingly the same helpful community member he had always been. Now, standing in the basement of the community center, looking into a hidden room illuminated by harsh construction lights, Sarah felt her instincts validated in the most horrifying way possible. The room was a shrine and a trophy collection and a confession all wrapped into one nightmarish space. Along one wall, someone had carefully arranged 3 separate displays, each consisting of personal items that Sarah recognized from evidence photos she'd memorized years ago. Megan Phillips' keys, the ones that had been missing from her purse, a delicate gold necklace that Victoria Hayes had been wearing in her last photograph. Brooke Carter's student ID, the one found in a stranger's yard 20 years ago, actually the original that had been reported missing. Not the ID itself, but a clear photocopy of it mounted in a frame. But it was the wall opposite the displays that made Sarah's blood run cold. Someone had carved names into the concrete, deep scratches that must have taken hours of work. Megan Phillips, Victoria Hayes, Brooke Carter. Below each name, A date: October 31st, 1991. October 31st, 1995. October 31st, 1998. And below the dates, a message that revealed motive and madness in equal measure. On the night she died, I found life. On the night I lost her, I found them. The forensics team that descended on the community center over the next 3 days processed every molecule of that hidden room with an intensity born from 20 years of frustration and failure. They found DNA evidence on multiple items, hair fibers that didn't match any of the victims, fingerprints on picture frames that held photographs of Halloween celebrations from different years. They found journals, handwritten books that detailed each abduction with a clinical precision that made seasoned investigators physically ill. The journals described how Brandon Lee had approached each woman, what he'd said to gain their trust, how he'd brought them to this room in the basement of the building where he worked, where he'd killed them over the course of hours while Halloween celebrations continued upstairs, children playing games and eating candy while 3 women died slowly just 1 floor below. The journals revealed what investigators had suspected but couldn't prove. Brandon Lee's mother had died on Halloween 1985, a sudden aneurysm that killed her instantly when Brandon was 19 years old. He'd been close to his mother, perhaps too close, and her death on Halloween had created an association in his mind between the holiday and loss and death and grief. The journals described how he'd spent the years after her death feeling empty, going through motions of normalcy while feeling nothing inside. Until October 31st, 1991, when he'd encountered Megan Phillips walking through the park, alone, vulnerable, and something had clicked in his mind. He'd offered her a ride, mentioning that her daughter Emma was in a program he coordinated, establishing trust through familiar connection. Megan had accepted, grateful for the help. He'd driven not to her home but to the community center, telling her he needed to grab something from his office first. Once inside, once in the basement, he'd revealed his true intentions. The journals detailed what happened to each woman in that room, and those details will remain sealed by court order. Too disturbing to share publicly, too traumatic for families who'd already suffered enough. What matters is that Brandon Lee had documented everything, creating a record of his crimes that left no doubt about his guilt, that provided evidence so overwhelming that even the most skeptical prosecutor could build an airtight case. But the journals also revealed something that gave investigators their next crucial task: the location of the bodies. Brandon Lee had buried each woman in a different location around Cedar Falls, places that held meaning for him, places he could visit to relive his crimes. Megan Phillips was buried on an abandoned farm property 15 miles outside of town, land that had belonged to his grandmother. Victoria Hayes was buried in the woods behind the community center itself, in a spot visible from the window of the office where Brandon had worked. Brooke Carter was buried in what was now a Walmart parking lot, but in 1998 had been an empty construction site where Brandon had worked briefly on a volunteer landscaping project. The search warrants were executed on November 8, 2018. 3 different teams, 3 different locations, and by the end of a long, emotionally exhausting day, all 3 women had been found. Dental records and DNA testing would later provide formal identification, but the items buried with each woman, the clothing and jewelry that matched descriptions from 20 years earlier, left little doubt. Brandon Lee was arrested at his home on the evening of November 8, 2018. He'd been watching television when the SWAT team breached his door, apparently unconcerned that a construction crew had been demolishing the building where he'd hidden evidence of 3 murders. Perhaps he'd thought the hidden room was secure enough that no one would find it. Perhaps he'd stopped caring. In the interrogation room, faced with overwhelming evidence, he initially claimed innocence, suggesting someone had planted the items in that room, that he was being framed. But when detectives presented him with the journals, written in his own distinctive handwriting, documenting details about the crimes that only the killer could know, Brandon Lee's facade crumbled. He confessed to all 3 murders, showing no remorse, explaining in a flat, emotionless voice that these women had filled a void in his life, that their deaths on Halloween allowed him to feel connected to his mother, that he'd been planning to take a 4th victim on Halloween 2018 but hadn't found the right person. The trial was brief. Brandon Lee's attorney tried to argue diminished capacity, suggesting his client's psychological state made him unable to form the intent necessary for first-degree murder. The prosecution presented the journals, which clearly demonstrated premeditation, planning, and awareness of wrongdoing. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Brandon Lee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, essentially a death sentence given his age and health issues. But for the families, the conclusion of the legal case was just the beginning of a different kind of journey. Emma Phillips, now 33 years old, finally got to bury her mother. She stood at the graveside service with a photograph of herself at age 6, dressed in her princess costume, held tight against her chest. "I want her to see what I looked like that night," Emma explained to Sarah Mitchell, who attended the service along with dozens of other people whose lives had been touched by Megan's disappearance. "I want her to know I was happy, that I was excited, that her last memory of me should be good." Emma had spent 27 years wondering if her mother had abandoned her, if she'd been somehow inadequate or unlovable, if Megan had chosen to leave. Finally knowing the truth, knowing that her mother had been murdered, that Megan had tried to come home but had been prevented by evil rather than choice, allowed Emma to forgive herself for doubts she'd carried since childhood. David Hayes attended Victoria's funeral service, wearing the suit he'd worn the night they got engaged, carrying the ring he'd kept in his pocket for 23 years. At the graveside, after the formal service concluded and most mourners had left, David knelt beside the fresh earth and spoke to Victoria as if she could hear him. "I never stopped loving you," he said quietly. "I never stopped waiting. I know it's too late now, but I kept my promise." He opened the small velvet box, looked at the engagement ring one final time, and placed it on top of the casket before it was lowered into the ground. He left the cemetery alone, but somehow less burdened than he'd felt in decades, finally able to grieve properly rather than existing in that terrible limbo between hope and despair. Robert and Susan Carter buried their daughter Brooke beside their plot in Cedar Falls Cemetery, planning to eventually rest beside her for eternity. They'd founded the October Coalition in her name, and now, with closure finally achieved in their own case, they expanded the organization's mission to help other families of missing persons, using their experience to guide others through the nightmare of uncertainty. They established a scholarship fund in Brooke's name for students pursuing pharmacy degrees, ensuring her dream lived on even though she'd never completed it herself. The community of Cedar Falls held a memorial service at Riverside Park on October 31st, 2019, exactly 1 year after Brandon Lee's arrest. 28 years after Megan Phillips disappeared, honoring all 3 women whose lives had been stolen on Halloween nights. The park was filled with hundreds of people holding candles, sharing memories, ensuring these women would be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Emma spoke about her mother's dedication to nursing, her kindness to everyone she met. David spoke about Victoria's passion for teaching, how she'd made learning magical for children who struggled. The Carters spoke about Brooke's ambition, her determination to help people through medicine, her bright spirit that lit up every room she entered. Detective Sarah Mitchell attended the memorial service, standing at the back of the crowd, watching families find closure that had been denied them for so long. She thought about the 11-year-old girl she'd been in 1991, frightened by Megan Phillips' disappearance, made aware for the first time that terrible things could happen even in safe places to good people. She thought about the detective she'd become, driven by a need to find answers, to bring justice to victims who couldn't speak for themselves. She thought about Brandon Lee, sitting in a prison cell, denied the freedom he'd taken from 3 women, denied the opportunity to kill again. The case became a teaching tool, used in police academies and FBI training programs to demonstrate the importance of interagency communication, the danger of assuming safety based on someone's public persona, the necessity of recognizing patterns even when they occurred years apart. Changes were implemented across Iowa, creating better databases for tracking missing persons cases, improving coordination between municipal, county, and state law enforcement agencies, ensuring that what happened in Cedar Falls couldn't happen again, at least not as easily. Brandon Lee remains in prison, refusing all interview requests, showing no interest in explaining his psychology beyond what's documented in his journals. He'll die there, far from Cedar Falls, from the community center where he committed his crimes, from the families he destroyed. His name is rarely spoken in Cedar Falls anymore, a deliberate choice by residents who prefer to remember Megan Phillips, Victoria Hayes, and Brooke Carter for the light they brought to the world rather than the darkness that took them away. Every Halloween in Cedar Falls, the community center's former location, now a small park with 3 memorial benches, serves as a gathering place for families who want to remember not just 3 women who died, but all victims of violence. All people taken too soon. Oh, lights extinguished by evil. The benches bear simple plaques with the names of the women and a shared message. Remembered, loved, missed every day. The Halloween vanishings remain etched in Cedar Falls' collective memory, but no longer as an unsolved mystery that haunted the community. Now they represent something different, proof that even cold cases can be solved, that justice delayed is still justice, that families who refuse to give up hope can sometimes find answers in the most unexpected places. The hidden room that held so many terrible secrets has been demolished, the community center reduced to rubble and carted away. But the memorial stands as a permanent reminder that these women's lives mattered, their stories mattered, their memories matter still. Emma Phillips works as a victim advocate now, using her own experience to help other families navigate the terrible journey from loss to closure. She keeps that photograph of herself in the princess costume on her desk, a reminder of the happy 6-year-old who didn't know Halloween 1991 would be the last Halloween she'd spend wondering when her mother would come home. David Hayes teaches a class at the local community college about resilience and grief, channeling his own long journey through uncertainty into lessons that help others find strength in impossibly difficult circumstances. The Carters continue their advocacy work, expanding the October Coalition to help families across the Midwest, creating the support network they wish had existed when Brooke first disappeared. And on Halloween night, as children in costumes run from house to house collecting candy, as teenagers attend parties and young adults celebrate at downtown bars, some people in Cedar Falls pause to remember 3 women who should still be here. 3 women who were taken from their community by someone they trusted. 3 women whose cases remained cold for 20 years before a construction foreman noticed an irregularity in a blueprint and decided to investigate rather than ignore it. The story of the Halloween vanishings didn't end with Brandon Lee's arrest. It continues in every family reunited with a missing loved one, in every cold case solved by persistent detectives, in every community that refuses to forget victims even when investigations stall. It continues in Emma's advocacy work, in David's resilience lessons, in the Carter's support of other families walking the same dark path they traveled for 2 decades. It continues in the 3 benches in that small park where people sit and remember and promise to never let evil erase the good that existed before it struck. Megan Phillips, Victoria Hayes, and Brooke Carter died on Halloween nights, victims of a predator who hid behind a mask of community service and friendly smiles. But their stories didn't die with them. Their stories live on in everyone who knew them, everyone who searched for them, everyone who refused to accept that their disappearances would remain forever unsolved. Their stories remind us to trust our instincts, to question assumptions, to remember that evil often wears the most ordinary faces, and their stories prove that truth, no matter how long buried, no matter how well hidden, eventually finds its way into the light.